Yes, good morning. Today is May the 5th, and as you saw, hopefully, in my Canvas post, Cinco de Mayo Day, which, trust me, is much less of a thing in Mexico than it is in the United States, and actually much less of a thing this year since most of the restaurants who pushed forward restaurants such as Don Pablo, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know if Don Pablo's still exists, but they pushed forward Cinco de Mayo Day as a way to sell beer. Yeah. The only day when you'll see, so many people in this country go around saying something. Oh, never mind. Anyway, Cinco de Mayo was actually commemorating a victory over the occupying French forces in 1862. Mexican independence had been established in 1821. Yeah, I think so, from Spain. Okay, so today we are continuing our discussion on the Industrial Age and Realism and Impressionism. And as I said yesterday, not my favorite movements in art. But I do want you to notice one thing. From the end of the Romantic period, and actually the Romantic period only lasted about 50 years. And the Romantic period had pretty much run its course by about 1850. After the Romantic period, though, what you find about artistic periods is that they are shorter and they change more rapidly. And thank you for that, probably, to Louis Daguerre and his daguerreotype, which we talked about yesterday. So hopefully you have pulled your study guide up. There is a test coming Friday, our last test of the year. Although if we need to move it back, we will. In Great Britain, the 18th century, the 19th century, the 19th century was the Victorian Age. The Victorian Age, a period of time where England was ruled by Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria alone, for most of the period, Queen Victoria, her husband was the famous Prince Albert. Prince Albert? Yeah, there was a Prince Albert. And I'm sure you mean like the tobacco. I mean, I don't know if you were ever juvenile, and trust me, I never did this. But if you were ever a juvenile and you told that old joke, there used to be, and there still is actually, you can still purchase Prince Albert tobacco in a can. It's for pipes, it's for rolling your own cigarettes or whatever. And of course, juvenile children would call up some store and say, "Hey, do you have Prince Albert in a can?" And they'd say, "Well, yes, we do." And then, of course, the kids would inevitably say, "Well, you better let him out." But yeah, Queen Victoria ruled alone because her husband, Prince Albert, died. I believe he may have died of some disease, which wasn't that uncommon back then, of people dying of communicable diseases. Imagine that. But she spent most of her life a widow, and most of her public appearances, she wore black. Everywhere wore black. Quite an oddity. But probably, if you look at all of the history of England, probably England as a power in the world was at its greatest height during this Victorian Age. The rule of Queen Victoria, which, as it says there, 1837 to 1901, 64 years. A mark that was only recently surpassed by Queen Elizabeth II. But yeah, and during this time, England in the Victorian Age owned 25% of the world's surface outright as colonies. They owned India, Australia, South Africa, Egypt, various and sundry islands all around the world. And so, yeah, and of course, the English Navy projected British power and wealth all around the planet. So, and this was an era which, by the way, the British prided themselves on being literally, and they did, they prided themselves on being the master race. Yes, I mean, and there were lots of people who made comments about that in Britain. Cecil Rhodes, for example. Cecil Rhodes, who you may or may not have heard of. Cecil Rhodes, the founder of the British colony and later the country in South Africa called Rhodesia. British Cecil Rhodes, the owner of the De Beers Diamond Corporation. Cecil Rhodes, a jingoist. And you say, what's a jingoist? A jingoist is a person who believes that the problems of a country can best be solved by going to war. Yeah. He was once quoted as saying the British are the only divine race on earth. And, you know, people like that phrase so much that other people around the world picked it up. It is worth noting a couple of things about the Victorian Age. Number one, it was during the Victorian Age that the British fought and put down the Boer War, a revolution in South Africa against Dutch settlers. A war that is often referred to as the first of the modern wars. And yeah, there are a lot of wars that claim that, but the British were the first. And see, here's another thing you probably didn't know. The British, Mr. Pugh, get this, the British were the first to make use of what became known as, wait for it, concentration camps. Yes. The British imprisoned many of the Dutch farmers that they captured in these camps, these internment camps, and there were concentration camps, make no doubt. The subjugate populace. And it was also during this time that the British considered that their lifestyle, their decorum, their dignity, was their level of civilization was higher than anybody else's in the world. However, underneath all of that prim and proper etiquette and manners and all those sorts of things. I mean, if you ever watch Downton Abbey, you might. And I've only watched one episode of Downton Abbey myself, although I've heard lots of kids just love Downton Abbey. But if you ever watch that decorum, that dignity, that formality that you see in Downton Abbey, this originated during the Victorian Age. But underneath that decorum, during the Victorian Age, 1 in 3 women in London and other major cities in Britain, 1 in 3 women made their living or supplemented their living at some point in time as prostitutes. That is a fact. 1 in 3. And you say, well, mostly these were poor women, right? Well, yes, they were. However, the people who utilized their services were not. And so underneath that decorum of being proper and polite, there's that. I mean, haven't you ever wondered, Miss Cook, haven't you ever wondered where the term Victoria's Secret comes from. That was Victoria's Secret. You know, I say that in the midst of the fact that I imagine Victoria's Secret, along with a lot of other businesses, are struggling right now. Anyway, let's get back to this. Forgive me. So in Great Britain, this was the age of the Victorian Age. Britain, like other nations of Europe and somewhat North America, was a nation of rising standard of living, rising technological advances compared to the rest of the world. Nothing like today, of course, but yeah. The transatlantic cable connected the United States and Europe. The transatlantic cable was a telegraph cable that they laid underneath the Atlantic Ocean, stretched all the way across it. It was considered a marvel of its day. Sanitation and vaccination for diseases, and electric lights in the major cities. Thank you, Thomas Edison. The 1851 Great Exhibition. We would call it the World's Fair. I mean, yeah. At first, they were called Great Exhibitions, and eventually the name became World's Fair. It's not so much a thing anymore, World's Fairs. I haven't, in fact, heard of one in the United States for years. Although in the 1980s, there were actually 2 World's Fairs that I recall. The 1982 World's Fair, very successful financially, occurred in, of all places, Knoxville, Tennessee. I didn't go there, but in 1984, the city of New Orleans hosted a World's Fair. I did go there. Whereas the Knoxville World's Fair, which if you've ever driven through Knoxville, and I don't mean taking the loop through outside of Knoxville, I'm talking about driving through downtown Knoxville, you can still see the Sun Sphere. And that is a leftover from the World's Fair. I don't know what's in the Sun Sphere now, but yeah, it's there. The Knoxville World's Fair was dedicated to energy. The New Orleans World's Fair, which happened 2 years later, was dedicated to water. The Knoxville World's Fair was a boom to the city of Knoxville, made lots of money for lots of people. The World's Fair in New Orleans, Louisiana, was something that the city of New Orleans was paying for the next 20 years. People stayed away from the World's Fair in New Orleans in droves. You say, how do you know that, Mr. Orton? Because I went there. Yeah, I think I told you about that. I took a trip down there. Me and a priest friend of mine traveled across the Southeast that summer, 1984. Didn't pay one hotel the whole time. We drove, stayed with my relatives or with his friends, visited a lot of Civil War parks. We were nerds. Spent the night in Tupelo, Mississippi. And I'm sure you all know that aside from being a place where my sister lived, Tupelo, Mississippi, the birthplace of some guy named Elvis Presley. We visited Shiloh in Tennessee. After spending the night in Tupelo, we then went over to Vicksburg, Mississippi, to that military park. Spent that night in Alexandria, Louisiana, at a parish rectory inside, a Catholic church parish rectory. They gave us a room. My priest friend had buddies. I remember the next morning waking up and having a maid fix me breakfast. Never. At any rate. But then we went to the World's Fair in New Orleans. Cost $15 to get in. And nobody was there. I mean, literally nobody was there. You could walk right into anything. It was incredible. Yeah. You say, well, what do they have at the World's Fair? What happens at the World's Fair is, of course, the host city and host country provide the biggest hall, which is an exhibition of advances they have made. For example, in 1984, when I was at the World's Fair, they had one of the space shuttles. Yeah, one of the space shuttles there. Pretty cool. But, every country sent things. For example, China sent rocks, a piece of the Great Wall of China. Other countries sent this and that. And, it was a walk right into all of them. It was amazing. So anyway, in 1851, the Great Exhibition took place in Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace in London. Now, I don't know if any of you follow what used to be the EPL, English Premier League in football, soccer. One of the teams that's never really very good is Crystal Palace. And that's where the name comes from. They built this giant glass and steel building. A building made, once again, of glass and not steel, iron. I'm sorry. Because it didn't have that kind of steel back then. They built an entire building, not of stone, not of wood, but of an iron framework covered in glass. And because that was supposed to be the future of architecture. And it housed the World's Exhibition and showcased all the technology and the ingenuity of that day. The building in it resembled a cathedral. It was built like a cathedral of iron and glass. It was also hailed as a cathedral of materialism, which is, centerpiece of the Industrial Revolution. Okay. The new modern philosophy of the day was something called utilitarianism, which basically equated the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It was founded by this guy named Jeremy Bentham, a British citizen. Goodness was to be found in pleasure and well-being of humans, not in some moral law like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, that was divine from a higher being. John Stuart Mill, who was a utilitarian, advocated women's rights, which in the 19th century made him something of a radical. He wrote In Liberty, and he also wrote The Subjection of Women. Actions, he said, are right in proportion that they promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Charles Darwin, during this era, wrote The Origin of Species, which is on your test. Now, a lot of people say that Charles Darwin came up with evolution. That is incorrect. Evolution as a theory had existed long before Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin came up with the idea of something called natural selection. Natural selection meaning that in an environment, nature will choose some species to thrive, other species to simply survive, and yet other species are chosen for extinction and elimination. And it is called natural selection. And the species who best adapt to their environment are the ones who survive and thrive, and the traits that they have are the ones that survive. So, yes, which leads us to something called social Darwinism. Now, what is social Darwinism? Social Darwinism is the idea that just like animals and plants are selected by nature to either thrive, survive, or be eliminated, that people, ethnicities, also are selected for that. And for the Europeans at the time, this made perfect sense. They said, This is the reason why we are able to dominate the globe, because we're superior. God or whoever made Europeans, and the British said, like Cecil Rhodes, the British said that was us. You know, that's why we own 25% of the world's surface, because we are superior. And fast forward this theory into the 20th century, and certain groups in Europe will say, then to make this place a better world, what we should do is that we should promote the superior race and do the job of nature like a farmer and eliminate the inferior races. You know, Mr. Halleck, I'm watching a very interesting series on Masterpiece Theater. I think you can pick it up on Netflix too. It's called World on Fire. And The World on Fire is this story that concerns World War II, the beginning of World War II. And what happens is the story concerns a family in Poland, a woman reporter, radio reporter in Berlin, an American woman radio reporter. It concerns a doctor living in France and a family living in Manchester, England, and how their lives intertwine. It's very interesting stuff. But here's the thing. The woman, the reporter in Berlin, is very shocked that the new regime, the Nazis, are removing, and of course, everybody's very familiar with the Holocaust and Jews, but the Nazis were also removing children who had disabilities, challenges. They would take them to hospitals under the pretense of better educating them, better caring for them, and they would never be seen again. And see, that is social Darwinism. The idea of you have these people who have physical and mental challenges, which also run into things like Down syndrome, homosexuals, communists, of course, and Jews, and the Roma, gypsies. And to make the world a better place, they would ship them off to these camps. And under the guise of helping society. And so how did the Europeans use this idea to justify their colonizing the rest of the world? Well, Europeans were white, and the rest of the world was not white. Therefore, yes, I had to talk about that. Europeans were white, the rest of the world was not white and not European. And since God made the Europeans superior, then they had the right to go out. And colonization is a nice word for military conquest. You can't colonize a country by persuading them with words. They have to be conquered, And the Europeans said, well, we're allowed to do that because we have the mastery of automatic weapons. And then also from this comes this thing called the white man's burden. I hope you wrote that down. The white man's burden. The white man's burden was an idea that was first proffered by our good friend Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling. You're saying, Rudyard Kipling. I've heard that name before. I just can't recall it. Well, Rudyard Kipling was a poet and writer, spent most of his life in India, and he wrote, a lot of stuff. What you probably best know him for is a book about a little Indian boy named Mowgli, Bagheera the panther, Baloo the bear, Shere Khan the tiger. Yeah, Jungle Book. Yeah, that book. It takes the bare necessity. Well, that same guy wrote that it is the white man's burden to care for his little brown brothers. Let's back up and go over that again. It is the white man's burden to care for his little brown brothers. And I mean, if you just kind of read over that real fast, it's a white man's burden to care for his little brown brothers. That's nice. That means that white people will go and take missionaries there and look out for, bring help and all that kind of stuff. It's probably one of the most racist things that you could say. Because look what it says. The white man's burden. White man. To care for his little brown brothers. In other words, people who are not white cannot take care of themselves. Therefore, they have to be cared for. That says that white people are entrusted with caring for them, and that non-white people need to be cared for. What does that say? That they are not intelligent. And by the way, I mean, white meant white. Even in Europe, people who didn't have, I don't know how many whiter people than me, people who weren't genders like this, were smarter and more superior than Southern Europeans, for example, Greeks and Italians, for example, Turks, for example, Spanish, Latinos, Portuguese, for example. And so, and so that the white man's burden was a theory that basically not only said, yes, Europeans have, the white, Northern and Western Europeans have the right to go out and take over the rest of the world, but when they do that, they're doing a service to the rest of the world. Interesting proposition. They're doing a service to the rest of the world by lifting them up, by civilizing them, by bringing them Christianity, by bringing them all sorts of, well, they didn't bring them material advantages. Yes, the white man, the Europeans, for example, built railroads in Africa, and the Africans maybe worked building the railroads. Perhaps they could work as servants on the railroads. But as far as enjoying the monetary benefits of the railroad or diamond mines in South Africa, it's very nice of those African peoples to dig deep under the earth. And I'm talking about very deep. And by the way, the European masters made those Africans dig for diamonds naked so that they couldn't hide them when they exited the mines. Very nice of those Africans to dig up those diamonds for Cecil Rhodes and people like him. They just didn't get to benefit from the, And so there. We are going to stop here today. That's our 30 minutes. I will continue tomorrow. I still intend to have the test Friday, but we shall see. At any rate, have a good day, guys. I've got some work to do, as I'm sure you do. It's a rainy day. Go, Mr. Halleck, go watch A World on Fire. I'm telling you, it's a good story. And Mr. Pugh, I think you'd like it too. And Mr. Niehaus. Um, and actually, Miss Cook and Miss Riddick, I think you'd like it as well. Have a good day. Bye now.